Okay, and so we're back, and in this video, we're going to take a look at basically completing all of the outputs for our material. So we're going to take a look at creating the albedo, normal map, roughness. We don't have any metallic, but we'll look at just basically completing that, our height and our ambient occlusion, so that we're going to be able to use all of these for our materials in games or animation or whatever we want, really. So before we do that, I just want to take a look and kind of show people kind of the versatility of how we've set up our material. So like I was saying in the first video, that this guy over here, our initial geometry, is going to be pretty handy in how just kind of the flexibility of how we're going to use this guy right here is going to be pretty useful for kind of the rest of the geometry for our height, because it's going to be pretty flexible in how we set it up. And you can see that we've got not a ton of nodes, but we've got a fair bit of nodes. And the way that we've constructed our graph so far, it really doesn't matter how we play around with this node here, because it's all going to basically intuitively remap to whatever we decide. So let's take a look at this tile random here. And if I go ahead and I just, decide I want to do 4 and 4, you can see it's going to, pretty smartly remap to that. If I do 8 and 8, you can see that we might have a little bit of an issue here, so we'll have to go back and maybe play around with our edge detect or whatever. But for the most part, it's pretty, intelligently remapped with our material. And we can go around and maybe play around with the position random, right? It's just going to be smart about how it actually remaps to just a change really in one of these nodes. So that's pretty cool, and that's really a great way, a great benefit of how we've set up our material. So that's something to just kind of keep in mind as you work and create your materials, is try and set it up in a way that if you change something earlier on in the chain, it will just intuitively work with the pipeline you've created. So I'm just going to go back to our 2K size. And so where we left off was we've created our height blend between our skin and our scales. And that's already looking pretty good for geometry. We're going to get a lot of information that we're going to be able to work with when we're creating all of our outputs. So the first thing I want to do to kind of situate us in a nice spot is create masks, because I want to be able to mask off our scales from our skin areas. And that's going to allow us to really get, kind of dig into the nitty gritty parts of our material, so that we can mask off areas to help us provide color information. We're going to go in and look at adding normal information, roughness. It's going to make our life a lot easier when we work with custom masks that we've created. And we're just going to be drawing it from the information we've already provided ourselves. So you can see here on this height blend, we have this blended height output, which we're using to see basically the blend between our two height maps. And we have this height mask. And this height mask is pretty much, for the most part, just a mask that's going to allow us to see the blend between these two heights. And so that's already situated us in a really good position. So what I want to do from that is I'm going to add a histogram scan node, and I'm going to plug this mask into the scan. And you can see with that, we're going to be able to play around with the position. And because the mask is already, for the most part, pretty binary, as soon as you give the position any value, it's going to just immediately snap to pretty much that same binary value, because there really is no gradient for the histogram to work across. Now you can see that there's a slight gradient here, but but if we go into our histogram, there really isn't that gradient. If we scroll along the position, we're going to be able to pretty much get that gradient there. But we don't really want that for our mask. We want to kind of have it as a pretty binary thing. So I'm going to just bring this all the way up to 1. And so that means that it's going to encompass the entirety of our scales just in a mask. And so now if I want to go ahead and pretty much get the inverse, mask off the scales and only leave the skin here, well, we can do that pretty easily with an invert grayscale node. And that's basically just going to mask off our scales and then leave the skin in between. And the reason that we're going to basically use this as a subsequent node to our histogram scan here is that if we change this mask, if there's any changes that we make, because we're chaining it this way, it's going to update intuitively. Like I was showing you with our initial geometry here, double click on that guy, the way that we've chained it together, it just intuitively updates. So if we make any changes, say to maybe to our gradient refactor, or maybe we move these around, or in the next video where we actually start to remove some scales, it's going to update our masks pretty intuitively, and so we don't even have to think or worry about how are we going to show this information or mask it off, because we've already created that base operation and it's just going to work for us. And so now that we've set ourselves up with the masks, I'm going to go ahead and start plugging in all of our outputs. So I'm going to remove that guy there, plug in our normal map, plug in our ambient occlusion and our height down here. And then I'm just going to create a grayscale uniform color. And I'm just going to plug that guy into our albedo base color there and our roughness. And I'm just going to make sure he's kind of like a mid-gray. And then I'm also going to create a grayscale black for our metallic. And I'm just going to leave that guy down there. So now that we've got all of our outputs kind of situated with something at least plugged into it, I'm going to right click on our graph and view outputs in 3D. And you can see that we haven't had really much of a change, and that's just because I was actually pretty lucky and I got this uniform color pretty close to, I think it's around 0.5-ish, where we actually have that on our base material. But you can see that now I can actually play around with this color in our outputs, and it's going to show up in our viewport. So I'm going to do 0.5 because that's what we're used to seeing. And so now we're going to be able to go ahead and start working on our outputs. So the first one I'm going to work on is the albedo. I'm just going to drag this guy up, give us some room to work with here. And so the way that I like to start working on my base color is that I like to basically find the big kind of tones that I'm going to be finding in my material. So we can see here that the big tones that we're going to be looking at are our scales and the skin. And those are going to basically radiate throughout our, or permeate, I should say, throughout our entire material, because it pretty much makes up, comprises of most of the material. So those are the two kind of tones that I want to address initially, and then I can start making more color information decisions based off of those big colors. So the first one I'm going to do is I want to find where we've got our skin here, and I'm going to add that to a gradient map. And I'm going to actually take this guy here, and you'll see why kind of in a second, but I'll explain it as well. If we are to ever come back and change the range of our histogram range here, that's going to affect the color values for our gradient map here. So if I just plug it in, use the input of the slope blur, we can change this range to any value we want, and it's not going to affect the color value that we have. And so if we ever run into an issue where we have to change the color value, we have direct control over it in this map here and not accidentally change any of our color values by using the histogram range. So that's kind of why I want to use the slope blur, because there is no difference in terms of actual information being skewed, as you can see between the blend and the slope blur, and it's merely just grayscale values. So I'm going to bring this gradient map right up here. And this is going to basically be the start of our grayscale, or our, I should say, our base color. So I'm going to plug that guy in and just bring this guy down here. So immediately we're going to get this really god-awful looking color information because it's just using the skin across the entire material. So what we now need to do is we need to create another color for our scales and then mask it off using one of the masks that we've created. So I'm going to come up to here and just drag in a uniform color. And the first thing I want to do with this uniform color is I want to change kind of some aspects about this, because when we're bringing this into an engine or an animation suite of some sort, we don't want to be rendering a 2K single color texture map here. So we can come into our base parameters here of our output size, and I'm going to change this to absolute. And so you can see that right now we've changed it from a 2K, which is relative to the parent size of our graph. It's now going to be 256. And you can see it there, as well as underneath our nodes. So with this, I want to go ahead and I want to decrease this down to 16 pixels by 16 pixels. I don't know why. Some computer math magic that I don't really understand. This is apparently the most efficient texture size or pixel size for our nodes. So this is going to be the most optimal size for our nodes to render with the most efficiency. So we're still going to get a solid color. We're just not going to have a ton of pixels to represent it, but we're still getting the color value. So this is going to be super handy when I blend this together. And I'm going to plug this guy in over top. And so now we're going to get pretty much entirely our material as black, because we've plugged that in over top. So I want to go ahead and I want to mask this off using one of the masks we created. And so we need to be cognizant of which mask we're using, because this one right here has got our scales as white and our skin as black, and this one has our skin as white and our scales as black. So we need to remember how our blends actually use these masks to interpret between the two inputs. So we need to remember that in a blend node, anything that is white in our opacity or our mask is going to take whatever is in the foreground input. In this case, it's going to be our black pixels. Anything that is black is going to take anything that is in our background. So with that in mind, I want to go ahead and use our initial histogram and plug this guy in, because the white values are going to maintain anything that is in the top input, and the black values are going to show what is ever on the bottom input. And so you can see now we've effectively masked off the two really blended geometries, and this is going to allow us to affect them individually and create kind of our own organic designs or details with this. So I'm going to bring this guy back up here. And so now I'm going to go ahead and I want to change this uniform color to a more appropriate color for our scales here. And so I'm going to go up to green, and I'm going to kind of bring them to like a little bit of a darker, a little bit desaturated green. So that's a good start. But now I want to go ahead and actually change the color for our gradient of our skin because we've neglected that so far. I'm going to click on this guy here. Maybe zoom in a little bit. And you can see that the difference between the uniform color and the gradient is that the uniform color is one solid color, but the gradient map is going to basically operate along a gradient. And so we've already seen this with our curve node where we can basically manipulate this gradient. But now if we use a gradient editor, we're going to be able to basically take these gradients and assign colors to each position in our gradient. So if we click on our graph, we're going to get these two handles here. And you can see that as I bring this up, our black's going to increase. And I bring this down, our white is going to increase. But we can also play around with the color values of this. So I'm going to click on the black handle and I'm going to change it to a little bit of a darker brown. And you can see it's changed it in our texture view here as well as our 3D view. And I'm going to just find an area that's a little bit brighter. There we go. And I'm going to click on our white value. And I'm going to make this a little bit of a brighter, kind of like a brighter brown. Again, a little bit desaturated. And you can see as I crank this up, we're going to get a little bit darker values. If I bring this up, we're going to get a little bit more contrasted areas. So we've basically just remapped the color values for our grayscale and just made them color information. So that's going to be pretty handy if we want to go in and add some more darker values kind of in the cracks and the recessed areas of our skin. But I'm going to keep that for now. That's looking pretty good. So the next thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and basically create kind of a color value for the rims of our scales here. And so I'm going to add a blend. I'm going to bring this guy out. And I'm going to take this uniform color because we've already got it set up for the base parameters output size. I'm just going to Control D. And I'm going to plug this guy in over top. And again, it's going to plaster it over everything because we don't have any mask. So that's okay for now. I'm just going to go ahead and I want to change this color to something a little bit brighter so that when we mask it off, we're going to be able to see where it's actually going. And so we're not going to be able to use really any of our binary masks that we've made because they don't really position themselves strictly on the rims of our scales. So what I'm going to do for this is I'm going to come back to where we've created the gradient refactor, and I'm going to use this as the basis for our mask. And so I'm going to take this guy here, and I'm going to come back all the way up to our blend and just plug that guy in. And so immediately we've already eliminated the skin areas, but it's showing up over the entirety of our scales. So again, I'm going to have to refactor this gradient, and I'm going to do it using the same methods that we've already seen a bunch of times in this tutorial, is just using a curve node. And so I'm going to bring this guy right back up here. And you can see that in our curve, again, the dark areas are denoted by this little handle down here. The bright areas are denoted by this handle up here. And so if I double click on this guy, we can start to manipulate the gradient and where it's going to show up on our material here. So what I want to do is I want to get rid of kind of the center areas of this to only push it outwards towards the rims of our scales. So I'm going to take the right handle down, and you're going to see immediately it's going to start to basically remove the gradient values from that area and make them black. And if I bring this guy in towards the center, you can see that it's going to almost just completely remove them. And that's going to be pretty useful for what we want to do, actually. You can also see here that maybe we're getting a little bit of bleed over as well. So I'm going to come into this side and just tighten them up as well. And so now we can play around with the opacity of our mask. We can play around with the sharpness of our mask too. And it's really up to you how basically sharp and contrasted you want this to be. I'm going to pretty much leave that kind of right there. And now I'm going to come into our material, and I'm just going to decrease the opacity here. Maybe bring it down to something like 0.5, just so that we're getting a little bit of color information kind of around the rims of our scales here. And so now the next thing I want to do with this is I'm going to go ahead and add 2 different blend nodes. And so this is going to allow me to basically add just more color information, and we're going to isolate our scales first just to kind of add some random color values so that they're not all the same kind of hue and saturation. Add a little bit more variety to each one of the scales. So again, I'm going to Control D, plug this guy in here, and I'm going to change the color to something like, change it to kind of like a desaturated blue. And I'm going to do Control D again. And I'm going to change this one to more like a gray. And you're going to see what we're going to do here in a second is that we're going to mask off just random scales and then use the blending modes in each one of these blends to kind of just give them a different color value. But the way that we have to mask these off individually is we have to come back to our masks here. And we're going to use this to essentially create varying color values that we're going to be able to use as masks. So what I'm going to do is add a flood fill node. And we've already seen this earlier in the tutorial. And so I'm going to take this guy here because we get very defined scale patterns, but they're just a little bit more updated than what we have way back here. As you can see that it's still a little bit more rounded edges, but over here we've got a little bit more cut in from the deterioration and all of the stuff that we've done along the way. I'm going to plug this guy in, and we're going to get our flood fill. And so what I want to do is I'm going to add a flood fill to random color. And so we're not going to directly be using these colors per se, but we're actually going to separate the RGB channels to use as 3 different masks. So I believe it's called RGBA split. And you can see that we're taking these color values and then creating 4 different masks based off of those values. And so this is going to allow us to have 4 different masks for these values. Now we only really need 2 masks, but we've got an extra 2 just in case we need them. So I'm going to plug in the R channel to this guy here, and you can see that it's really only affecting a few of them that are white, and the varying grayscale values are going to basically pretty much mimic if we were to lower the opacity across them. And for this blend here, I'm going to go ahead and take the green channel and plug that guy in. So you can see that now we're starting to get a whole bunch of different colors showing up over top of all of our scales here. And so now for this blending mode, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit overlay. And you can see that it's not really doing a lot, but if I bring this down to 0, we're just kind of darkening a few scales. I'm going to go ahead and maybe bring that down to something like 0.8. And for this method as well, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do multiply. And this is also going to just darken a few of the values. I want to bring this right back down to something like maybe 0.5. And so that's just going to give us a bunch of different values for our green, but it's still going to maintain kind of the same hue range. Okay, and so now that we've kind of got the general color tones for our scales, I'm going to go ahead and continue to add a little bit more information onto them. So I'm going to add another blend node here. And this one's going to add just a little bit of kind of like sun bleaching to our scales. And so I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate this guy here, plug him in, and I'm going to kind of just take a nice warm kind of sun color. Maybe make that a little bit brighter. Something that's a little bit like an off-white, kind of like almost like a cream. And so with this, we're going to go ahead and we're going to have to not really draw from our binary masks once again, but instead I'm going to come down to our height blend, and I'm going to use this as kind of a mask for us here. And so instead of a curve, I'm going to do a histogram select because I want to find the region that we're going to be able to use based off of our scales here. So I'm thinking a little bit more towards the top faces of our material. So I'm going to bring the position up. I'm going to make sure that our contrast is up a little bit as well. Maybe decrease the range. And I'm going to bring this all the way, or pretty close to all the way up. And this is kind of the area that I want to be targeting, so I'll maybe bring the contrast down a little bit. Just to kind of hit those faces there. Maybe bring the range up a little bit. And then I'm going to change our blending mode to overlay. So now that's still looking a little bit too, not exactly how I want it to look. Maybe I'll bring this, bring this up to maybe a little bit brighter value. Something kind of like that is a little bit nicer. So it's going to make kind of the faces of our scales a little bit brighter. And we can just play around with these as well. Yeah, so that's starting to look pretty good. So the next thing I'm going to do is kind of emphasize our scratches a little bit more. So again, we add a blend. Going to control and duplicate. And this time I'm going to do a darker brown. Again, a little desaturated. And so the way that we're going to kind of hit these crevice areas or these cracks is we're going to need to use our normal map. So I'm going to bring this guy right back. And you can see that in our normal map, we're going to get a lot of information about the cracks and everything. And I can actually bring this normal map back up to 10. And that's going to just add a little bit more power into our surfaces. And we can use a node that's going to draw from this map to find kind of all of the cavities and the edges of our material. And that's going to be a curvature map. And you can see that as I plug this in, we're going to be very easily find all of that edge information. And that's going to be super handy for us because we're going to use this guy as a mask to find all of those recessed areas. So we can play around with the intensity of this as well. And maybe I'll leave it on too. But I really want to be kind of finding these regions with our levels node here. So I'm going to actually plug this guy in first just so we can see what we're doing. And you can see that right now, the way that it's working is that the white areas are where our dirt is going to show up. And so our white areas right now are finding the edges of our material as opposed to the cavities. So we just need to invert our handles here. And so now, if we were to bring in the white value, you can see that it's starting to define our cracks just a little bit. So I want to make sure that we don't really get any of that dirt on the faces of the scale. And I feel like that's a little bit too much as well. So I'm going to bring that back. Maybe play around with our middle as well. That's pretty cool. So now I'm just going to come in here and just bring down the opacity as well. You can see that at 0, it's kind of hard to see. 1, maybe a little bit too sharp. So I'm going to bring this to like 0.45. And maybe bring back some of the white. You know what? I'll bring this down to 0.35. Just something that's a little bit, a little subtle, but still visible. We want to be able to actually see this color information, and that's going to just kind of help sharpen some things up. And now I want to add a little bit more like speckle, grunge or like small little extra organic detail to our scales here. So again, we're going to add a blend. And for this guy, I'm going to use an edge wear. And this is going to be just a generator or a filter that we're going to be able to plug into our opacity. And it's going to be kind of like a smart mask for us to use. If you've ever used smart masks in Substance Painter, it's pretty much the same idea. So this takes a curvature node, which is awesome because we have one right here. So I'm going to plug that guy in. And you can see it's just going to basically find all of our edges and create a mask for it. And we can play around with these values as well. And so this is going to allow us to, I Control D this guy, just play around with some extra grunge and wear to our scales. Now the problem you can see is that this is also affecting our skin. And I don't want this to be something that's on the skin. I want it to be pretty much just scale exclusive. So what we can do is if we come down here, we're actually going to be able to use one of these masks to basically subtract from this mask here and only give us the scales. So I'm going to add a blend node onto our edgeware here. And so now again, thinking about which blend we're going to use, I want to use something to subtract from our mask. I want to subtract our scales. And so when you're subtracting something, the white value of the top input is going to basically remove any values from the bottom input. So that being said, this is why we have this guy here, because I want to go ahead and use this to subtract from our selection. And so now you can see that when I hit subtract, it's going to just remove all of these white values from all of the white values here, resulting in this. And so now it's pretty clean. We can just go ahead and play around with, this as much as we want. It's never going to affect our skin unless we change something before this mask. So that's going to be pretty handy. I'm going to bop this guy up here. And I am going to first off change this uniform color from this brown to kind of like a little bit of a beigey gray. And I want to change the blending mode to soft light. And this is going to give it kind of like a dried out effect, like it's been scratched and kind of died off a little bit, but it's still dead cells that are kind of hanging on to these scales. So now we can come down and play with our edge wear here. Bring the level down, bring the edge width way down. Play around with the threshold, although I find the threshold is very finicky. Bring the contrast up as well. Whoops. And maybe bring the levels down just a little bit. That's pretty cool. So now what we can do is go ahead and take this blend, just bring the value down a little bit. Maybe find a value that fits in a little bit nicer. Maybe something like that. I bring in the value again. Do something like 0.6. So that's starting to look pretty cool, actually. So I want to continue ahead creating some more information for the albedo of our scales. And so now what I want to do is go in and kind of just create more, some more rigid color information for the insides. Because right now they look pretty soft and they're not giving the same sort of realistic effect of like having very micro surface information. So I want to go ahead and just kind of change that. So I'm going to add another blend. And this time we're going to start off by creating a directional scratches. And so this is going to be a grayscale node, and we're going to convert this into a color information once we do a little bit of alterations to it. So I'm just going to plug this guy in, and I'm going to add a gradient map. So we're going to be able to see this guy over top of our material. And right now I'm going to change the angle, and I'm going to change this to 90 degrees. And so we're going to get our directional scratches going up and down. And I want to change the angle random just slightly so that they're going up and down, but they're kind of going at random angles there. So now what I want to do is kind of add a little bit more randomness and like shape morphing to these splines here. So I'm going to add a slope blur. I bring these guys up just a little bit. And I'm going to add a fractal sum base. And this is going to allow us to, again, just kind of play around with those lines there. We bring the intensity way down. And I'm going to let's do max. And if we play around with the levels, just to get some, like popping and some rigidness, I guess, in our shapes here. And so the last thing I want to do with these is I want to basically conform them kind of to the scales themselves and just kind of like move them around. And so the way we're going to do that is we're going to do a vector warp grayscale. And just like we've done before, we're going to use the vector or normal information from our geometry that we've already made. And so you can see this requires a color input. So I'm going to go down to our normal map, and this is going to give us the basis for the geometry or the vector that we're going to warp around. So I'm going to bring this guy into here, and you can see now it's going to just kind of loop around and have some sharper areas. And I'm going to change my vector mode to OpenGL. Again, that really does not make much of a difference. And we can play around with the intensity. You can see that 0 gives us that effect. And if we warp it way up, maybe something like 5, you can see it's starting to get a little bit noisy, so I don't think we're going to go that far. But maybe we'll do 1 just to give a little bit of warpingness to it. And so now the last thing I want to do is I want to mask off, again, our skin areas. And so we can do that really easily. We just come down here to our scale mask. We bring this guy in here. Boom, there we go. So we've just masked it off. And now I want to go ahead and switch our blending mode to overlay. And this is just going to maintain the hue of the green values that we have, but it's going to basically darken and lighten it in the various areas. I'm going to bring this right down to something like maybe 0.1. And this is just going to add some nice kind of like scratchy, raked effect to it. That's looking pretty cool. And so now we're going to finish up creating the albedo here by just adding a little bit more weathering effects to our textures. So I'm going to add a blend. And so I just want to add a little bit of grunge across our material here. So I'm going to go ahead and use a dirt 1, and this is going to be our mask. And you can see that it's going to give us a bunch of just different little dirt specks, and we're going to be able to just use this again with the varying transparency and grayscale of it to mask off dirt around our material. So I'm going to go back here and just duplicate one of our low resolution uniform colors. And you can see immediately what it's going to do is just kind of like speckle our material here. And I want to have a little bit more control over that, because with our dirt, we only really get to do scale and disorder. But if I use a histogram scan, now I'm going to be able to kind of move through the dirt and be able to get varying intensities for our mask here. We can also play around with the contrast. I'm going to change this color to be a little bit beigeier. And I'm also going to bring the intensity way down, something like 2.3. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Just a little bit of like speckle and dirt over top. And I want to add some dirt more towards kind of the sides of the rim, just like it would kind of collect in the crevices and everything. So I'm going to add a blend. And so I'm going to use a fractal sum base node, because it's pretty good at producing, just kind of like nice soft noise. And so if I add a gradient onto this guy, I'm going to again play around with its values. So for the white, I'm going to make it kind of like browny. I'm going to bring the black up. Just have like a darker brown. something like that. Maybe make this a little bit saturated. And so again, I want to mask it off only kind of towards the rim areas of our scales. So I can come back here to where we've done that for our base texture there. And I can just bring this guy in over here. And so you can see that this is going to, again, kind of just affect the nice areas that we had. But I find that it's a little bit too dark because we've been using a black value. And I used a black value because we're going to be able to take our blending mode and switch it to screen. Whoops. And this is going to just remove all of the darker areas and keep just some of those, the lighter dirt. And I'm going to bring this value down again, something like 0.3, just for very subtle effect. And finally, the last thing that I want to do that I find just kind of cleans up a lot of the muddiness of my albedo is I use a sharpen node. And so if we just type in sharpen, you can see that it's going to find a lot of information. If we go down to 0 and then 1, it's going to find us a lot of edge information, a lot of detail. And I find that 1's a little bit too much. So I like to dial that back to maybe 0.5. 0.5 looks pretty good. It just gives us a little bit more crispness in our textures there. And so now that we've completed pretty much the basis of our albedo, I want to go ahead and start working on our normal map. And so before I do this, I'm going to just take our grayscale value here for our roughness and bring that down so that we're just going to make this a little bit glossier so we can kind of see what the information is doing. So the first thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to add a fractal sum base node. And what I'm going to be doing here is I want to add some more variety or normal information to our skin. I want to kind of have little specks of like very, very micro surface detail. So the way we're going to do that is I'm going to run this guy through a normal node. And I'm going to bring the intensity up to something like 10 so that we get a lot of information and we can see what's going on. And I'm going to add a normal blend. And I want to make sure that I am going to take the normal and plug it into there. And then I'm going to take this guy and plug it into our normal output. So now that I've got that plugged in, you can see that nothing is really happening. And that's because we don't actually have an input. So you can see that if it says use mask is false, now it's going to overlay this noise over top of everything on our normal map. And actually, it's just replaced our normal map. And if we play around with the intensity, you can see that we kind of blend between the two normal maps. But in our case, we actually do want to use a mask because we want to mask it off just in the areas where there's the skin. So if I come back to our masks, I want to make sure I select the skin mask. And now you can see that it's only affecting the area in between our scales. So I'm going to bring the opacity way down to something like 0.2, maybe 0.25. And you can see that we're getting just a little bit more normal information, just adding a little bit more variety to it. And now I want to go ahead and start adding some normal information to these little kind of specks that we have, put across our material here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up and find where we've created them right here. And I'm going to add a normal. and plug this guy in here. I'm going to bring this guy down onto our normal chain here. And I'm going to do a normal combine because we've got this right now just overlaying over top of our entire material here, right? We haven't masked anything off. I want to make sure that we just preserve that and place it across our entire material. And so right now it's pretty good. It's showing up everywhere that we want it to show up, but it's a little bit too noisy. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that we set this to high quality. And that's really going to get us kind of in those areas where you can see that there would be a little bit more of a gradient. And I'm going to come back up to the normal map that we've got running from this guy. And I'm going to plug it down to around 0.15, something like that. Maybe even just 0.1. Just very, very small information. You can see that because we've got such a glossy material, it's pretty easy to see. But once we add a little bit of roughness to it, it's going to be a little less noticeable and a little bit more of a subtle effect. So now that we've completed our normal map, I want to go ahead and start working on our roughness map, because right now we've got a super glossy, basically one color value map, and it's going to make everything look just pretty much like butt. So we're going to go ahead and start working on this guy. I'm going to bring these down. And I'm going to get rid of this. I'm just going to make everything super glossy. And the basis that I use to create my roughness maps, if you've seen any of my tutorials, you're probably already 5 steps ahead, is I use the normal map as kind of the basis for our roughness. So I'm going to plug this guy into our roughness. And this is not going to be, it actually doesn't look too bad, surprisingly, but this is not at all what it's supposed to look like. And I want to go ahead and I want to use a curvature smooth node. And the reason I use a curvature smooth is because it finds the edges of our geometry pretty well. And a lot of what our roughness map or glossiness map is derived from is edge information and microsurface. So this is a pretty good map to use for the initiation of our roughness. So now the problem with the roughness, though, is that roughness maps use black as very glossy and white values as very rough. So that's not really going to work too well, because that means that our glossiest or shiniest values is kind of in the crevices of our material. So I'm going to use a levels node, and I'm going to invert this selection. And if I bring the black value in, you can see that the surface of the scales starts to get very glossy. If I bring the white value in, maybe bring the black back a little bit, you can see that we're introducing some roughness into our material. So for now, I'm going to leave that because I want to set this up so that, again, we have a control for the roughness of our scales and the roughness of our skin. So I'm going to control and duplicate that guy. And I'm going to add a blend and just shift steal this. And you should probably already know where we're going right now, is that we need a mask to mask between these two, scales and skin. And we've already created that mask. So at this point, it really does not matter which one you use. You just need to remember which value is representing which input. And so I like to keep my scales as the top input. If I come back here, I want this levels to control my scales and this levels to control my skin. So because our scales is on top, that's going to be a white value. I'm going to use this scan. I'm going to plug that in. And so immediately nothing's going to happen because these are the exact same levels nodes. But if I start to bring this guy in, you can see that I've just basically created a super shiny skin surface. We kind of get in here, you can see that it looks very glossy, very shiny, but it's not affecting our scales. And so I want my my skin to be relatively glossy. Let me bring that back. I also want to bring in the black output and the white output so that it's not completely shiny but not completely glossy either. If I bring this down like that, something like that. So it's got a little bit of specularity to it. Actually, I might bring this in just a little bit more. Maybe bring my black down. So it's not super shiny, but it's also not super glossy either. Or rough, I should say. That was the same thing. So now we can play around with our scales independently of our skin here. And again, I'm going to do the same thing, bringing our white, our black. And I want our scales to be a little bit more rough. If I take a look here, play around with the scales, add a little bit of specularity to them. And you can see here that it's very receptive to specular reflection. However, it's not very sharp. And you can see that's because I've played around with the black output, so it can't actually, I've clamped the value for how dark it can actually go. You can see that if I bring it all the way down, I've increased the range or the amount of black that's allowed to basically be output by this node. And you can see the intensity is far greater because there's less roughness. And as I decrease the amount, you can see that it becomes much rougher. And so this is a great way to clamp the output of your grayscale values so that you don't actually exceed 100% glossy or 100% rough. Something like that, where it's a little bit glossy, but for the most part, it's pretty rough. That's looking pretty cool. And so now the last thing that I want to do is I want to add a little bit more roughness kind of to that edge wear that we had made in our albedo. So what I'm going to do is add a blend node here. And I'm going to come up to where we have that edge wear mask that we've made. And so I'm going to take this guy here. Because it's a grayscale value, that's what we're going to use for our roughness. And I'm going to plug that guy in. And so right now it's just going to override it with that. And what I want to do is I want to use this mask to basically create a rough area for anywhere that we've masked off. So any of the white areas we've made for kind of those dead cells like I was talking about earlier, I want to use this mask to make it so that those areas are rough. And so with this mask, I want to keep the white values because that means it's rougher. And these are kind of those dead cell areas that I was talking about earlier in our albedo. So one method that we can use to blend between these is I want to keep the white and remove the black. And we've used this already where we use a screen to remove the black areas and maintain the white. Now this is a little bit too much as it basically means this is 100% rough, and that's not going to be the case. So I want to bring our blending way down to something like 0.1 just to get a little bit of information there. But again, you can see the difference is that we've got a little bit of a glossier area and now it's a little bit rougher. And so that's going to basically complete our roughness map. And so now we've completed our roughness map. I want to go ahead and start basically finalizing our last three outputs. And these ones are very easy because we don't really need to do much with them. So we can see down here that I've created a black grayscale uniform color node. And this is just going to be our metallic. Now there's no metallic values for this material, so we're just going to leave it black. We don't need to denote any areas as metal because there's nothing there. So just a little bit of efficiency tips, like we've been doing up top with our albedo. I want to change this uniform color to absolute, and I just want to decrease its size to 16 by 16 pixels. And so now this is basically just going to say, yep, nothing is metal, but I want to use as low resolution as possible to determine that. And so our metallic is good. Our height, again, I like to keep this control over our height so that if I want to increase the range or the position like we were doing back with the skin, I have this flexibility right at the end there. And so we can play around with this to get something a little bit more in line with what we want to do for our height. And so right now that's okay. And lastly, our ambient occlusion. And so now we can play around with this if we find that maybe some of the areas are a little too harsh. We can drop it down a little bit. But for the most part, that's looking pretty good. So we've gone ahead and completed all of the outputs for our material. So at this point in time, we can consider this material, for the most part, maybe give a few tweaks, but consider it done. So in the next tutorial, we're going to take a look at basically creating a bunch of different parameters that we can expose to make this material much more versatile, such as changing the color based on a slider or removing scales themselves and creating an undercoating for our material.